Hi everyone, my name is Jenny Gensick and I'm the founder of LearnFromAutistics.com, a website which aims to connect parents and caregivers with autistic voices and expertise, and it helps promote autistic writing and autistic endorsed resources. On the website, I regularly interview individuals on the spectrum, and I compiled a lot of their advice and created a book with advice from autistic adults titled What Your Child on the Spectrum Really Needs, Advice from 12 Autistic Adults. And I'm currently working on another advocacy project with another person on the spectrum on the topic of parent advocacy and allyship. This webinar compiles some of the most popular advice I've been offered from the autistic community regarding neurodiversity and best practices for promoting autism acceptance, which is a very worthy pursuit and ultimately results in more confident and capable autistic children. So I'll just offer you a really quick background on me to give you some context to my work. I'm a neurotypical mother of 4. My oldest is diagnosed with autism and cerebral palsy, and I have a younger brother on the autism spectrum. I started engaging directly with the autistic community about 6 years ago to obtain better advice for how to raise my autistic son, and I'm really grateful to have met wonderful autistic self-advocates early on in raising my son, and I'm confident that he has and will continue to benefit from the advice that I've learned from autistic experts. And I've kind of launched into this space to try and help other people on the spectrum and give them just better support and kind of create a society that's more inclusive and accepting of autism. I'm on a continual personal journey to learn more about disability, ableism, and allyship to keep improving my parenting and my friendships and work towards autism and disability acceptance. I'm not an expert on autism, and I've made many mistakes in the space, but I try to constantly improve by listening to the real experts, which are people on the spectrum, and sharing what I learned to others who may not be taking advantage of autistic expertise. So the content in this webinar is really geared toward parents, relatives, caregivers, teachers, or therapists of individuals on the autism spectrum. Some people believe that the principles of neurodiversity that I'm going to talk about in this presentation specifically are better suited for families with children who are verbal, diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, PDD-NOS, or what they refer to as high-functioning autism. Approximately 70% of the spectrum. However, most of this information can be beneficial for all individuals on the spectrum, so I would ask you to try and keep an open mind if you can. So neurodiversity is a concept that encourages the acceptance of a variety of different neurological conditions. And what this means for autism is that autism is considered a natural neurological variation rather than a defect or flaw. Because of this, many neurodiversity advocates assert that autism should be embraced, accepted, and celebrated for the same reasons as diversity in so many other aspects of life is celebrated. Unfortunately, over the years, the more common emphasis is for autism to be hidden or eliminated. Some autistic advocates say autism is pervasive and affects every perception of the world someone has, that it is intimately tied to identity. They believe that if you are trying to eliminate autism, you are trying to erase who they are. Not all autistic advocates identify this intimately with autism. Some say that autism is not who they are, but a part of them, and non-autistics should respect whatever their identity preference is, obviously. The point is that NTs, or neurotypicals, or people who are not on the spectrum, they really shouldn't be controlling the conversation on autism, how it should be viewed or treated, or how other people should identify. So there is a resistance movement to the concept of neurodiversity, with the largest voices being NT medical professionals and caregivers. However, there are some autistic self-advocates in the mix as well. A few of the main arguments against embracing neurodiversity are summarized here. First one is neurodiversity advocates are only highly verbal autistics or those with mild symptoms. I have spoken with many verbal autistics who advocate neurodiversity, but there are many non-speaking advocates as well, and I do have a slide later here listing some of those advocates for anyone interested in reading some of their work. Another one is Neurodiversity Advocates oppose therapy. So it's common for neurodiversity advocates to oppose specific kinds of therapy that aim to eliminate autistic traits, for example, or if the therapy is focused on the person. If the therapy is not focused on the person's interests and they're forced instead to participate, or if it doesn't respect their input. ABA is one example of a commonly condemned therapy within the autistic community. But most neurodiversity advocates welcome therapy that helps them address struggles in specific areas of their life that they want help with. OT to address sensory sensitivities, for example. There's a difference between therapy that aims to eliminate autism that an autistic person didn't want to participate in the first place, at any age, children or adults, and a therapy that is initiated by the autistic person and whose goal is to help that person find ways to manage areas of their life they struggle with. So there's a difference between those two things. Non-autistic people participate in all kinds of therapy. So anyone who claims that neurodiversity advocates oppose all kinds of therapy is really referring to a small subsection of those who embrace this concept. Another common argument against neurodiversity is the idea that supporting the neurodiversity movement is dangerous because too much public attention on accepting autism will lead to a lack of funding to support services that autistic people need now. So I read this perspective in an article a few years ago written by a neurotypical parent scientist, and it aimed to draw attention to those she described on the severe end of the autism spectrum, because one could claim that who cares whether or not anyone agrees with the model of neurodiversity? If some like it and it works for them, why not embrace it? So this perspective that this author was defending suggests that the problem with too many people adopting this mindset is that society will no longer view autism as a problem, and perhaps government funding might actually be taken away from research and cure initiatives or other support services needed by those on the, quote, severe end of the spectrum. In one of my interviews, I asked Julia Bascom, the executive director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, what a neurodiversity advocate might say to anyone who cites this issue, and I'll just read you her response. Julia said, "I'd encourage them to look at the advocacy work ASAN does." ASAN is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, which is overwhelmingly focused on people with significant support needs who rely on publicly funded supports. Our work on fair wages, supported decision-making, communication rights, organ transplant discrimination, and home and community-based services are all examples of this. The fact is, the ideas that the neurodiversity movement tries to advance, inclusion, bodily autonomy, self-determination, human rights, are the most important for autistic people with the greatest impairments. The self-advocacy movement was founded by people with disabilities who were institution survivors. The modern disability rights movement was put into place by people with disabilities like polio and muscular dystrophy, who often need 24/7 assistance. That's not an accident. Disability rights is for all people, and it is most critical for those of us who are pushed farthest to the margins. So there's a lot of division in this community, but often it comes from both sides pointing out the most extreme advocates or smallest yet still loud subsets. There's really a lot of common ground with this mindset to benefit all people in the autistic community. An important tenet of the disability rights movement is understanding both the medical and social model of disability. Different people categorize autism in different models, and others suggest it falls into more of a hybrid model. So in summary, there's some definitions here. The medical model suggests a person's disability is a problem that lies within the individual, and the social model suggests that a person's disability reflects a problem with the environment. So the disability exists because there's a problem with the environment. So here are just a few examples of these models in action. The first situation says a person in a wheelchair can't access a building that only offers a stairway entrance. So the medical model would say that the person's wheelchair is the disabling factor there, versus the social model would say that the stairs and lack of a ramp are the disabling factors. If the If there was a ramp there, the disability would not exist. The second situation is an autistic student cannot deliver an oral presentation because the fluorescent lights are too distracting. So the medical model suggests that the student's sensory sensitivity is the disabling factor, whereas the social model would say the fluorescent lighting is a disabling factor. If the lighting were different, then the disability would not exist. So the social model of disability challenges people to change their vision of normal, to stop assuming that typicality is always superior, and to create a more inclusive environment, which are all things that would benefit the autistic community. So some people like to consider autism as a hybrid disability model. Some co-occurring conditions are more easily classified within the medical model, while others make more sense within the social model. Another issue is that autism has many common co-occurring conditions that make it even more difficult to define and attribute specific symptoms to the autistic condition. In some cases, many symptoms of these other conditions are attributed to autism when, in fact, they might be related to something else. Therefore, when people say they want to eliminate autism, this statement gets a little fuzzy. Do they really want to eliminate the entire autistic condition, or perhaps these other co-occurring conditions, or both? Common co-occurring conditions include anxiety, depression, seizure disorders, dyspraxia, sensory processing disorder, ADD, ADHD, GI issues, sleep disorder, and OCD, to just name some. Because each of these conditions can occur independently of autism, it's difficult to attribute all of the effects of these conditions to autism. But because co-occurring conditions are so common, it's also difficult to pinpoint exactly where the autism ends and something else begins. Another important part of understanding the neurodiversity movement is understanding neurotypical privilege. Neurotypical privilege is the ease with which neurotypicals navigate life because their society has developed accommodations that cater to most of their needs. By better understanding neurotypical privilege, it's easier for advocates to recognize the needs of those around them, try to understand the lived experience of those on the spectrum, and better support, accommodate, and include them. So I've listed just a few examples below. This is from the Square 8 blog. This might help people get a glimpse of what autistic people can face. These are just some examples of neurotypical privilege. If I have a medical problem, I do not have to worry that my doctor will dismiss it as part of my neurotypicality. I am not considered more dangerous and more likely to commit a crime because of my neurology. I can reveal my neurology to my boss and coworkers without fear of losing my job. No one speculates about whether I am competent to raise children based solely on my neurology. When prospective parents speak of wanting a healthy child, I know they mean a child like me. I can discuss my interests at length without this being viewed as a symptom. So here are some things neurodiversity advocates commonly do. They emphasize immediate supports and societal change. Most neurodiversity advocates also support autism research, but they focus their efforts on how people and society can change now to improve the lives of autistics. They also avoid talking about autism cures. Many autistics believe this is an impossible pursuit anyway, and that people who appear to be cured are only more skilled at hiding their autistic identity and passing as neurotypical. But so much time, energy, and money is spent on autism prevention campaigns, it's clearly misleading to claim that all autistics are on board with the neurodiversity movement. However, if you haven't been engaging with the autistic community, I definitely recommend it because autistics in incredible numbers have been coming forward for a while now to assert that the neurodiversity movement is one to be embraced, and autistic rights are the next civil rights movement. The points on this slide illustrate where autism prevention campaigns become problematic, as identified in the many interviews that I've done with the community. The autistic brain is complex and not fully understood. Autism presents differently in different people in areas of pragmatic language, social awareness, monotropic mindset, information processing, sensory processing, repetitive behaviors, and neuromotor differences. Autistic people exhibit incredible variation. Co-occurring medical conditions complicate autistic symptom identification, so it's unclear what we would actually be trying to prevent. Also, there are some advantages to having an autistic brain, and some advocates worry that research into autism prevention will lead to selective abortion and eugenics. While some traits are easily identified as disabling, others may only be condemned for being strange or weird. For example, consider rocking or other stims. Everyone stims, neurotypical as well as autistics. But what makes tapping a pencil or bobbing a leg, which are common neurotypical stims, more socially acceptable than rocking or rubbing some fabric? Those behaviors are or should be considered neutral. But not all autistics want the same thing, and some would readily accept a cure, or at least the opportunity to shed some of the most difficult symptoms. I want to pad this next slide with the clarification that these language preferences are certainly not universally accepted by everyone on the spectrum. However, many do accept them and advocate for this specific type of language. Many people that I've spoken to have. And because historically the default and the sometimes promoted approach to discussing autism has included language like this, I'll summarize the problems that many on the spectrum have with some of these statements to shed light in this area that I think is commonly misunderstood. So this is a slide that shows like examples of what not to say, and here on the next one I have some alternatives to use. So instead of saying he has autism, you could say he's autistic, if the autistic person uses identity first language. This is the difference between person first and identity first language. If you haven't heard of these terms, I would encourage you to look them up. Plenty of autistics have written about their preference for identity first language, which emphasizes autism as a part of their identities rather than something they can get rid of. Many equate their autistic identity to their femaleness or maleness, or like at least in the ways you would talk about it. So, for example, just like you wouldn't say she's a person with femaleness, you just call them a female. Some people don't like to be considered a person with autism. Instead, you just say they're autistic. So the other one says he's high functioning. So you instead might say he's verbal or comment on specific strengths. This is another hot topic in the autistic community that you can find plenty of information about online. Autistic people have been speaking out against functioning labels for a long time. The problem is that functioning labels are not very informative and can be misleading. Some people might be considered high functioning in some areas or in some environments, but low functioning in others. It's really much more accurate to describe specific strengths or needs. I interviewed autistic fiction writer C.L. Lynch a while back, and I was going to read from that interview, which is on the Learn from Autistics blog, because she offers a good response to those who insist on using severity labels. She says, "There are many different flavors of autism, and some are much more visibly disabling than others. The most obvious examples are the people who are often called severe autistics, the people who cannot control their muscle movements and are therefore seen, even by their own parents and therapists, as being oblivious and intellectually disabled. Even the lucky ones who are given access to letterboards and OT to help them gain control of their muscles still often require one-to-one care. There is no question that their autism affects both them and those around them severely, so I can understand why the label is used. But really, it isn't that their autism is more severe. It's that they have motor control issues called apraxia that I do not have. But if you ask any autism specialist if autism is, at heart, a motor control problem, they will tell you no. Maybe they're wrong. Certainly all autistic people have strong feelings about the world around them and how they interact with it. But for now, apraxia is considered a side order to the main dish that is autism. So if autism isn't a motor control problem, then why do we call autistic people with motor control problems severe autistics? Shouldn't they be autistic people with motor control problems? Or shouldn't they have apraxic autism? That's the end of the quote. But there's a lot written by autistics on functioning levels, so if you're interested in reading more, you don't really have to look far. But another way that this sort of functional labeling becomes problematic is because neurotypicals often think they're offering a compliment when in fact it could be offensive. So another person on the spectrum discussed this in an interview I had with him, and he said, when a doctor or another person refers to me as being on the high-functioning end of the spectrum, it doesn't really make sense to me. Does that mean that I'm almost normal? What pops into my head is, there's him, he's that dot right there, like they're graphing the whole thing. I don't really understand what they're basing their decision on. What is normal? Do people think it's a compliment to be considered high-functioning? To be considered almost normal? So that's just an example of how our intentions might be a little misplaced. So another example here is a common phrase that people say is, we're lucky we caught it early. Sometimes people say this about kind of pushing kids into large amounts of therapy at young ages, hoping that they were able to rid them of their autism at an early age. So instead, you might say something like, we're committed to helping him thrive in his environment. We're learning how to make the changes he needs, and he is learning to adapt better every day. The next few statements are ways of discussing autism that treat it like a disease that needs to be eradicated rather than a neutral neurological condition. So the suggested alternatives here just emphasize supports for positive living. So for example, we treated his autism, he's cured now. You could instead say, we're offering him the right supports to help him succeed in the ways he wants to. Another example is, he doesn't look that autistic anymore. You could say something like, he is learning to adapt to his environment and advocate for himself. So those who embrace the neurodiversity paradigm can and have experienced some of the benefits below. It helps individuals achieve educational, social, and professional rights. It builds self-confidence. It allows them to realize the power of positive thinking, making the most of their reality and using their gifts to achieve goals. It promotes peace and acceptance, teaching society to embrace disability and improve living for all autistic or otherwise disabled people. And it helps autistics achieve varying levels of independence as they learn to communicate their specific needs and utilize their talents. Here's a wonderful list of websites and books to check out that prioritize autistic voices, and these are just great places to start learning about neurodiversity, autism acceptance, and autism from people on the spectrum. A couple of these, like Loud Hands and The Real Experts and All the Weight of Our Dreams, those are all anthologies, so there's a bunch of different autistic voices that are compiled in there. And some of these websites are the same. They accept autistic writing, and so they publish a lot of articles about autistic expertise and opinions. So it's a wonderful place to start learning about neurodiversity and just kind of build your foundation for how you want to live and work with the people around you. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're interested specifically in hearing about autism from non-speaking autism advocates, I just listed a few here that have published several books and articles about their experiences and different autism advocacy ideas. I'll just wrap up here with some quotes from Jim Sinclair's essay, Don't Mourn for Us. Sinclair is a popular autistic rights advocate, and this essay was originally published in the Autism Network International newsletter. And these quotes kind of sum up a lot of the sentiments of the neurodiversity paradigm. So Sinclair says, autism isn't something a person has or a shell that a person is trapped inside. There's no normal child hidden behind the autism. Autism is a way of being. It is not possible to separate the autism from the person. And if that were possible, the person you'd have left would not be the same person you started with. Therefore, when parents say, I wish my child did not have autism, what they're really saying is, I wish the autistic child that I have did not exist, and I had a different non-autistic child instead. This is what we hear when you mourn for our existence, that your greatest wish is that one day we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. Sinclair says, yes, there is tragedy that comes with autism, not because of what we are, but because of the things that happen to us. Be sad about that if you want to be sad about something. Better than being sad about it, though, get mad about it, and then do something about it. The tragedy is not that we're here, but that your world has no place for us to be. So, in conclusion, autistics have spoken to both sides of this issue. So, I recommend staying in touch with the autistic community. Make sure that they're the list of experts that you're consulting on a regular basis. And whatever side or whatever specific advocacy, neurodiversity, or identity preferences you or your child have, you still need to advocate for their needs, and reaching out to the autistic community is a wonderful place to start. And you're likely to learn a lot even if the people you read or speak to don't match your child's specific needs, so keep an open mind. And constantly speaking negatively about your child or how they live will surely hurt their self-esteem, so the neurodiversity paradigm really has a lot of more positive ways to discuss autism and raise just more confident, capable children and adults. And teaching and modeling how to live a positive autistic life will help you and your child embrace what you can't control and really appreciate your child's unique identity. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I hope the information in this webinar will help you spread autism acceptance and embrace and support the autistic people in your lives. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions at jennagensick@gmail.com. And please check out the Learn from Autistics website and blog, Facebook and Twitter pages. And if you're interested in reading more about neurodiversity and general parenting tips from autistics, you might like the book I've compiled from some of my interviews with individuals on the spectrum. It's called What Your Child on the Spectrum Really Needs, Advice from 12 Autistic Adults. I also have a limited number of copies available if you'd be interested in receiving a free copy to review. Just feel free to email me if you're interested. So thanks for listening.